Hi everyone, I am Natalie Schwatka. I'm an assistant professor in the Environmental and Occupational Health Department, and I am the director of our Certificate in Total Worker Health program. And in this lecture, I will be talking about studying the culture and the role of leadership in building healthy and safe work environments. This is the first part of the lecture on leadership roles. So the learning objectives for this lecture are first to be able to describe effective leadership practices, list why effective leadership practices are related to important health and safety outcomes in the workplace, describe an example leadership development program, describe the employee's view of a healthy business through a health and safety culture survey, and apply the total worker health business and culture data to understand total worker health needs. So we will go over the first 3 learning objectives in the first part of the lecture, and in the second part we will go over number 4, and in a separate sort of activity lecture I will go over number 5. So the focus of this lecture is on what's depicted here in this figure. So if we want to improve health, safety, and well-being outcomes, that's our ultimate goal, we must develop a culture and a climate that supports employees, and this can be accomplished through leadership capacity building. So this is the framework that really guides everything that I'm going to be talking about today. So keep this in mind as I'm going through the slides. So leaders drive culture in the organization. And the way that we define total worker health leadership is by focusing on the sort of practices or behaviors that leaders can practice in the workplace to demonstrate that they care for workforce health, safety, and well-being. So the definition here of total worker health leadership is someone who is acting to motivate and inspire others towards achieving health, wellness, and safety goals by sending clear and consistent messages about the importance of health, safety, and well-being. So if climate is about employee perceptions of organizational priorities, it follows that leadership practices constitute the main source of information about climate. Now, there's probably a lot of different factors that go into developing a culture of health and safety in an organization, but really, if we're going to focus on one thing, if we're going to devote resources on one thing, we need to be focusing on leadership. And the reason why we're doing this is because leaders really do create an environment in the organization. They have a lot of sway about it, and I have a couple quotes here that sort of illustrate this to get us going. So the first quote here is from a study of what happens after a work-related injury and the role of coworkers in this. So in this quote, the worker says, "I ended up cutting my hand in the stud when I was a second-year apprentice," so they're a very new employee. "I went to my foreman and he started laughing at me." The foreman is a supervisor. And he said, "Come on, you're a big baby." And I'm like, "I'm not a big baby. You told me I have to report all accidents, so I'm doing what I'm supposed to do." "Oh, are you going to fill out the report, or you're not going to fill out the report?" He says to the supervisor. "Oh," and the supervisor says, "Oh, you're a big baby." And so I'm kind of left there. What do I do, right? So this sort of illustrates the real impact that formal leaders in an organization can have on workplace safety, because in this situation, the worker cut his hand and he went to his supervisor to report it, which is what he's supposed to do. All accidents need to be reported. They need to be written up as a first report of injury form if they're going to get workers' compensation coverage for it. And when he did this, when he followed the procedures that the company had around this safety issue, his supervisor laughed at him. So what would you do in this situation? Would you ever report an accident again? Would you bring up safety issues to your supervisors? Probably not, and the result could be an increased risk for injury in the future because you're not being as safe as you could possibly be. Here's another example from an employee in Colorado. This person said that seeing the leadership in the organization either adopt or not adopt healthy practices or encourage them has a huge impact on them. And they've had leaders that really just support it and model the way. They think it's a great example if people feel more comfortable and willing to adopt health and safety practices when they see the value and hear about the value from their leader. And on the flip side, when they have leaders that don't see it as much of a priority, you lose that key example, and it doesn't trickle down the way that they feel it needs to in order to have an impact in the organization. So I think what's key from these quotes is employees really can perceive what is the true value and priority for safety in the organization, and they're getting that by watching what leadership is doing in their organization. When we think about leadership, there are so many different theories of leadership out there in the management literature. This one review article that I have here outlines 66 theories of leadership, which is crazy. But I think the point is people recognize the importance of leadership in the organization and the power that they have. And folks have been trying to figure out what are the best qualities of leaders that elicit the best outcomes. I think in terms of total worker health, the best way to think about the leadership styles is to think about it from someone who has a less active style to someone who has a more active style. And the ones that are more active in their leadership practices elicit the best health and safety outcomes. So on the bottom left here, we have leaders who are employing an abusive leadership style. Maybe they're publicly ridiculing someone for bringing up a safety issue in front of the rest of the team members. Maybe they're blaming workers for their injuries at work. Maybe they're intimidating them. They don't want them to report an injury at work. And so this type of leadership practice elicits, as you can imagine, the worst outcomes. In the middle here, we have passive leaders. These leaders aren't necessarily, they don't have bad intentions when it comes to leading for health and safety. But again, they're being passive, and they're not reacting, or they're not acting proactively to address issues. So they're waiting until total worker health is an issue. If an employee comes to them with a health and safety issue, maybe they have an accident, they'll do something about it, but they're not doing the work ahead of time to prevent that injury from occurring in the first place. And then at the top where we have transformational leaders. The theory of transformational leadership is really the most popular leadership theory studied out there, and it's been applied a lot in the occupational safety space, and to a degree somewhat in the health promotion space as well. But leaders in this who are employing this style of leadership are first and foremost leading by example. They are wearing their personal protective equipment when they're on site. They are taking sick time when they need to. They aren't emailing people after hours at work. They're also good motivators and inspirers, so they know the importance of talking and communicating with their teams to help them understand the vision for total worker health in their organization. They, too, number three, they're problem solvers. So they are willing to tackle difficult total worker health issues, come up with solutions to them, test them out, evaluate them. And finally, they're good coaches. And also what goes along with coaching is mentoring folks when it comes to health and safety. And so the key issue from the slide here is that we want to help leaders and organizations become more active total worker health leaders, where they're using this transformational leadership skills to proactively work on developing the right policies and programs that protect and promote employee health. So at the Center for Health, Work, and Environment, we've come up with our own 5 key leadership practices that are relevant to total worker health that leaders can use to demonstrate that they value total worker health. And so what we have first here is someone who's a passionate advocate who understands the value of total worker health, and they're doing the work to, for example, integrate that value into their business's mission and vision statement. They're communicating about it with their employees. 2, they're providing a supportive work environment, so they're engaging their workforce in total worker health and helping them become part of the decision-making process, and encouraging employees to take advantage of the policies and programs around total worker health. Number 3, they're being a role model. I already kind of mentioned that earlier on the other slide. They need to be following the health and safety policies and programs as well. 4th, they're encouraging growth and change. This is often the hardest leadership skill for folks to tackle because it involves trying something new, taking a risk, and learning from it. But this is the one that can really help the organization transform the way that they're doing total worker health. And finally, number 5 is expecting and recognizing success. So they are giving feedback, both positive and negative, to employees around total worker health issues, and they're also giving feedback to the individuals in their organization that are responsible for total worker health, whether that's the safety manager, the HR manager, the wellness manager, etc. So there are some less commonly studied leadership characteristics out there that may, I think, be related to health and safety, and also potentially important in addition to the 5 that I just talked about, such as being open and authentic around health and safety. I think employees are really good at knowing when their leaders are just, pencil whipping their duties around total worker health leadership. So having that air of authenticity is important. There's other forms of leadership around there, ethics, equity, relational leadership theory. But the last one I have here is on shared leadership, and it's something that I'm personally interested in because we typically talk about leadership in terms of one individual, maybe the owner, or maybe focus on training this one supervisor. But I think that, as I'll talk about later, it's sort of important for everyone in an organization to develop their leadership skills to be able to influence total worker health in an organization. So leadership practices are associated with health and safety outcomes. And you can take a look at the Mullen and Kellaway article to look at some of this evidence. But I think it's really important to understand that leadership is related to health and safety outcomes, and there's a lot of empirical evidence that is the case. And there are several meta-analyses out there. Meta-analyses are studies of studies. So they go out and they do literature reviews and pull all of the individual studies of leadership, and then we'll compile them together to look at across all of these studies, do we see a significant relationship? Is there a consistent theme happening here? And what these meta-analyses are finding is that leadership matters for safety outcomes. So it's related to safety climate, which we'll talk about later, safety behaviors at work, occupational injuries, burnout, satisfaction at work. It may be related to safety behaviors, like I said, but also when it comes to health outcomes, meta-analyses also find that good leadership is associated with well-being at work, which they've defined as exhaustion, anxiety, depression, or work stress. It's also related to taking time away from work for sickness-related reasons, disability pension. It's also been associated with a number of health outcomes like heart disease, high blood pressure, problem drinking, smoking, mental health, well-being, stress, depression, sleep quality, etc. So there's clearly evidence that leadership matters. And the question is, so if leadership matters, what do we do about it? How do we develop effective leadership practices in an organization to influence important health and safety outcomes? And the way that we do that is through leadership development. And I pulled this quote from Kevin Kellaway's article on leadership development as an intervention in occupational health psychology, because it does a nice job of explaining kind of how leadership development relates to primary prevention. So in the quote, he says that leadership development is not primarily intended to affect the experience and behavior of individuals who participate in the intervention, which are the leaders. Rather, when we do leadership development, our hope is that it actually affects those who do not participate in the intervention, i.e. the workers. So we hope that if we train supervisors or business owners on the importance of total worker health leadership, we teach them about the effective leadership practices, that they will then go back into their work environment, use these practices, and develop effective health and safety policies and programs that are implemented that ultimately will influence worker outcomes. So in this way, leadership development is a promising means of primary intervention, which is really our goal in public health, right? So the strategies that we see in the literature around how to develop leader, a lot of this work has been done in the safety space. And what we see is there's a lot of different formats out there, from maybe no training, but ongoing feedback on how much they're communicating with their employees about safety, all the way to trainings that maybe are 1 day, 3 days, 20 days, or even 120 days, where there's lectures. Maybe they get 360 feedback from their peers, their employees, their own managers, on-the-job practice to practice leadership skills that they learned about in lectures, and involving employees in the process. And what they've seen from this literature is a number of outcomes. So we see positive things on the leader side. So after these trainings, leaders report better attitudes about safety, better self-efficacy, which means they feel more comfortable being a leader for safety, greater intentions to promote safety with their team and leadership practices. On the worker front, remember from the previous slide I said that we hope that our leadership development influences workers. Our studies actually see that workers are reporting better safety communication and better safety climate. So they, after leaders are trained, employees tend to report that their organization cares more about their safety than before. There are very few leadership intervention studies that are focused on health promoting leadership. If the development studies are happening, it's usually around something specific like mental health or work-family balance. And there are very few leadership development programs that are holistically focused on total worker health. So I want to set the stage for, what are the assumptions of total worker health leadership? And first, I think that anyone in an organization can be a total worker health leader. Obviously, it's important for those in a formal leadership role, from the owner to top management to supervisors, to use their skills, but I think there's an opportunity for employees to develop their own leadership skills as well to influence health and safety in their organization. Two, I believe that leadership can be developed through training and practice, and I think that's the general consensus in the leadership and management literature. Early on when, decades ago when people started studying leadership, they thought that maybe, people are just born with it. The only certain people can be leaders, but I don't think that's the case. Everyone has their own style and can flex what works for them and downplay what doesn't. I think that total worker health leadership is a social process between leaders and followers, and by that I mean that a leader isn't operating in isolation. They have to engage and empower their teams and involve them. I think that some leadership skills are more relevant in situations than others. So leadership is adaptive. So sometimes maybe they need to flex on the ethical leadership, or they need to flex on the transformational. Next, I think that leaders need to be knowledgeable about total worker health, but they don't have to be the experts. When we're talking about formal leaders, I think that they need to understand enough about total worker health to realize they need to be supporting the people in their organization that run total worker health, like the HR, the safety manager. And finally, total worker health leaders are ethical. This is especially important when it comes to the health and health promotion piece around data privacy and things like that. So like I've alluded to earlier, I believe that total worker health leadership applies to all those levels of an organization. Top management sets the stage. They can allocate their resources, set the vision, and make sure that everyone knows that total worker health is valued and important for their organization. The health and wellness and safety managers and coordinators are also total worker health leaders. They are tasked with managing, developing the relevant policies and programs, and they can use leadership skills to influence how effective they are in practice. Mid-level management and supervisors are responsible for implementing policies and programs in practice. They definitely need to be using their leadership skills to influence whether or not their teams are following policies and programs and practices. And workers, finally, I believe, have an opportunity to be leaders too, because they're utilizing the policies and programs, and they're supporting their coworkers' use of them in practice. So up next, I want to talk about an example total worker health leadership development program that we have at the Center for Health, Work, and Environment, and that we evaluated with businesses who are in our Small Safe Well study that was funded by the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health as part of our Total Worker Health Center of Excellence grant. So our philosophy is that when training leaders, particularly the small business owner or other senior managers, so someone in sort of a senior level leadership role, is that they need to understand the context behind total worker health in their organization. And the context being they need to first understand what business practices or what's their business strategy around total worker health. And they need to understand the employee perceptions of these business practices. And then finally, because we're talking about health and leadership, we believe it's important for the leader to also be focusing on their own health and well-being, sort of that role modeling piece. And the leadership skills that I talked about earlier, those 5 skills, leaders should be using those skills to influence all of 3 of these contextual things. So our program is 10 hours spread over 4 months, and we focus on those 3 important contexts. And within the training, we educate them on each of the contexts, and we have them review their data, which I'll talk about in a minute, related to those 3 contexts, set goals that they want to work on for 3 months, and give them feedback as they're working on their goals along the way. Our target audience for this particular program has been the owner or other senior manager, but when we were piloting this program, we realized that the owner or other senior manager found a lot of value in attending the leadership program with a colleague, typically their safety or HR manager. They enjoyed coming as a pair. I think it's because it allowed them to develop that shared vision and shared goals around what it looks like in the organization. So we ended up allowing 2 people from each organization to attend the program. Our program entails, first up, assessments and reflection. So assessments around their business and their employees' perceptions as well as their own health and well-being. They take that, and from there, we compile a report, give them their data that they can then look at during an in-person 1-day training. So during a 6-hour in-person training, we take them through educational aspects around total worker health, give them their data, let them look at where they're at in their organization, and help them set goals that they're going to work on for the next 3 months during the training transfer period. So as you can see, our program is not a one and done kind of training. We really emphasize that they need to come to this educational in-person 1-day training, but they need to be assisted and given feedback when they're trying to apply what they're learning in the training back at their place of work. So I mentioned we do a lot of assessments, and we really take a data-driven approach to this program. So first, the leader is given their Health Links business assessment results, and this scores them on their policies and practices around total worker health across 6 benchmarks. And this really helps them think about what their current total worker health business strategy is and where they need to improve. We next give them the results of their employee health and safety culture survey. So before the training happens, we ask that they send a survey out to all of their employees, asking all of them to take a survey around their perceptions of the culture in their organization, and we give the aggregated results of that back to the leader. And then finally, we ask them to take a survey around their own leadership skills and their health and well-being. During the training transfer period, like I mentioned, it's a very important stage in their leadership development where we offer them 3 one-on-one virtual coaching sessions that are 30 minutes each to go over the goals that they set during the in-person training and discuss challenges and opportunities. And then we also used an online social goal setting platform where they could, in the in-person training, input their goals, and then for 3 months after the training, track their goal progress using the platform. And next I'm going to show you a video that's a little bit long, but I think is really good. It gives you a sense for one of the leadership pairs that were in our program, just what they learned, what they found interesting, and what they wanted to work on. So it'll give you a good insight into their mindset.
I'm Sasha Solkowski. I am the accounting manager for Brinkman Construction and the wellness lead for all of Brinkman Incorporated. Yes.
And I'm Dan Miller. I'm Director of Human Resources and Talent Development for Brinkman with the Shared Services Group. I think what I learned the most is that all companies seem to be experiencing very, very similar things with stress levels and workload and trying to figure out how to get more done with less resources and in less time. And I guess I was really appreciative of seeing a number of companies in a variety of industries here to learn and spend a full day talking about this topic. I think that's something that I've struggled with a number of times, is getting the focus to be there. realizing we heard a lot about the mental health side of things, and it's not tangible enough, I think, for companies to focus on. Physical injuries are very obvious, and then it gets time and a commitment and focus to keep safety as a priority. But the mental health and the way that people show up every day is highly affected by a number of factors. And if we as a company don't recognize that, we're not doing ourselves a service or the employees, which obviously affects the bottom line and the company going into the future. So. Yeah, I think that, the part that stood out the most to me was the focus on ourselves, and made me realize how much I don't do that, even though I thought I was. And so I guess, again, having conversation about that with others, realizing the importance of me holding myself accountable to, to wellness and health, and being the example that we really need to be in order to get buy-in from all levels of the organization, and being able to sell that into what Sasha said too, of just knowing that there is an organization and a group out here that is fostering that. I've thought for many years that just societally we don't focus on maybe I wouldn't say we don't focus on it, but it's a last priority, because again, it's not tangible enough to focus on how people are showing up. They show up, you just do your job, and there's so much more to it.
Mm-hmm. I think the first thing that I'm going to do when I get back is really rededicate something that I already spend a lot of time and energy on. Personally, rededicate it to trying to get true buy-in from as many people as I can by figuring out what motivates them, not just taking what we think motivates them and trying to incentivize and wrap people in by giving them gift cards, etc. I really want to take the time to go out to our job sites and our the different groups within our organization and find out what motivates them, what drives them, and truly find a way to engage everybody, at another level. So that would be my next step, I hope.
For me, it's taking back the commitments that I made today and focusing in on those, realizing I overcommitted when I did it. So, I got caught up in the moment, and I will fully admit that. So it's a matter of boiling that down and really understanding what's realistic to be able to accomplish in 6 weeks or 12 weeks, whatever it is. But we're also going right into our budgeting and strategic planning for next year. So to be building this into that and having conversations with, like we heard early on today about leadership buy-in, that unless we have that, we're set up to fail a lot of times. So I think it's really a matter of helping convince that level of the importance of it, that we at least bring it in and incorporate it to some level. We don't change from who we are today to something all focused on that, but certainly incorporate it in as a part of who we are and a value.
Yeah, our strategic
to focus
initiatives.
on. Yep, exactly.
And we'll definitely have walking check-ins for accountability.
Exactly. Exactly. Yep, walking meetings from here on out.
Yeah.
So I know that was a rather long video, but I hope that you enjoyed hearing about total worker health leadership from the perspective of two folks who are actively trying to influence the health and the safety and the well-being of their workers. What I liked from what they were saying was that first of all, they're a construction company, and what they were really focused in on after the training was how important mental health is in their organization, and that's something that they wanted to focus on because, as a construction company, they typically will have the safety culture locked down, but they needed to start focusing on the health side of things, and they were tuned into focusing on mental health, which was positive. I also liked that he mentioned that he needed to, be focusing on himself, which speaks to the leadership skill of leading by example or being a role model, that he recognized that he needed to come back and really think about, his own health and safety. So I liked that. And then from her, I really liked that she was talking about that she needs to go back and really truly understand employee needs and figure out how to motivate employees beyond just thinking about incentives, which is really important because our research here in Colorado shows that the leadership and the culture in the organization is a huge internal motivator for employees to engage in total worker health. And so if we can focus on this leadership aspect and, maybe start to think about not using incentives so much like gift cards or whatever, we can create a more sustainable culture where health and safety are always practiced. When we ran leaders through this program, we asked them about their readiness to change the way they're practicing total worker health leadership in their organization. And what we found was that leaders were coming in at different levels, from less ready to more ready. And the takeaway here is that I think business leaders and even yourselves need to recognize that people start at different levels of readiness in their intentions to be leaders for total worker health. It's a big undertaking, and so focusing on or really understanding what level folks are at before you go through leadership development program can sort of dictate the kind of training that needs to happen. So if someone's really in the pre-contemplation or contemplation phase, maybe the training needs to focus on just what is total worker health, what's the business case for it, what's the value for it, versus if folks are ready and really and ready to get going, dedicated to it, maybe the training needs to focus on more action type items of how do you actually use leadership skills to influence total worker health in the organization. So when leaders go through this program, we see positive change in their self-report leadership practices of the 5 key leadership practices that I mentioned earlier. This is pretty exciting to see positive change. It doesn't look like much on the screen here, but it was statistically significant. So leaders are reporting that they're engaging in more leadership practices after the program. And you might be asking yourself, what are they doing when they are trying to apply these leadership skills in their organization? And I have the 3 most common goals here listed. The first one is that, these small business leaders are really just focused on, I need to write a plan for my total worker health program. I need to think about this overall business strategy for it. But at the same time, they're really interested in engaging their employees and asking them directly for their needs and interests. And then finally, they're taking time to enhance their own health and well-being. We also asked leaders to be thinking about, what's going to make it easy and what's going to make it hard for them to practice total worker health leadership when they leave the training. And this is what they said. So the things that make it easy for them was that, a lot of them have teamwork, they have good support, they have good work-life balance, they have good leadership. But a lot of them have barriers. So a lot of them experiencing stress. They have too much work, they don't have enough control, there's too much time pressure. So I think recognizing the challenges that leaders are going to face when they try to apply this in their organization up front and make a plan for how to address the challenges when they arise is an important part of development as well. So what we learned from training small business leaders around total worker health leadership is that employee engagement is central to total worker health leadership. Leaders in our study really enjoyed getting the results of their employee health and safety culture survey, and they wanted to get more feedback on it. So they were very interested in engaging their employees more around total worker health. We also learned that it's important to not only train leaders during an educational session, but how can we actively help them apply leadership training to their job? And I think the best way that leaders can do this is to collaborate with partners at their organization. They need to have others who are also total worker health leaders who are going to help them execute on that vision. Because, like this quote says, there's just not enough time, people are overwhelmed. And so to feel like you are taking on that sole total worker health leadership role can be overwhelming and immobilizing. And we also learned from our study that leaders' work stress levels actually increased after our program. I'm not really sure why that happened. We didn't have a control group, but I suspect that it could be a function of we're adding something else to their plate as leaders. They're already very busy trying to run their organization. And so I think what this means is that when leaders are trying to implement this new skill of being a total worker health leader, they need to make sure they're taking time for their own mental health. I think it's important to explain to you all, before we move on to the second part of the lecture, to understand why we're focusing on the 3 core themes around the business strategy of the employee and the leader themselves. And a few years ago, we did a qualitative study, an interview study with small business leaders, and we asked them about how they actually go about total worker health leadership in their organization. We wanted to understand how they're talking about it. And what we found were the 3 core themes that we've been talking about this whole time. And so by far, most of the time, leaders are focused on talking about their business strategy. That's what they understand. And practically none of them are talking about total worker health from the employee perspective. And then some of them are at least talking about their own health and well-being. So when they're talking about their business, they're commonly referring to sort of a health and safety program they have in place, what kind of communication strategies they have, ways that they're getting feedback from employees. Maybe they're also talking about like the ROI or the VOI of their programs. And at least 10% of them are sort of talking about barriers they're having around total worker health. If they're talking about themselves, they're commonly talking about how they lead by example. This leadership skill is probably the most well-known, the one that comes to top of mind for most people. And to a lesser degree, they're talking about how they're considering having individual consideration, maybe by talking to individual employees and getting to know them. They're talking about some of the time how they're actually participating in the health and safety program, or outcomes of why, like when they participate in health and safety, why that's good for their health. And like I mentioned earlier, they're rarely talking about total worker health leadership from the perspective of their employees. And when they do, unfortunately, the most common thing they're talking about is how employees are a barrier to success, which is unfortunate because a lot of employers really struggle with employee engagement in their total worker health initiatives. And the first thing that they think about when they think of employees is that, they're not engaged, like I'm really struggling to get them engaged. And so I think the purpose of our leadership program is to really help them understand how to engage their employees to make their programs more effective. So in summary, I hope that you've learned that leaders are understanding total worker health from the business perspective the most. So if you're going to be talking to a leader in an organization, they're going to really understand total worker health from the perspective of what kind of policies or programs they have. And if they're going to be talking about their employees, a lot of them are going to be thinking about how they're going to be thinking about engagement issues, like how do I engage my employees in these policies and programs. And I think that they'll understand the value of leading by example, but they're not really going to understand the other leadership skills about visioning and motivating and inspiring. So thank you for your time on this first part of the lecture. Head to the second part to learn more about the employee view of a healthy and safe business.